One of my favorite things about Bleach is the way Kubo structured and told his story. Kubo communicated the writing elements of his work like themes and both character emotions and goals in such a unique and poetic manner. And when I say poetic, this is by no means an exaggeration, as he literally used poetry to foreshadow events, emphasize core themes, or even develop and complement characters. But the poetic storytelling in Bleach is not limited to having a poem at the end of every manga volume, but rather a combination of unique artistic choices, including poetry, that were present in almost the entirety of the story. Keep in mind that Bleach's story is not similar to the majority of shonen, as it is character-driven instead of being driven by plot. It focuses more on characters' journeys, and their actions are what moves the story, and the plot revolves around them, hence why Kubo focused on character development, but he did it in a subtle manner. Kubo leaned heavily towards showing instead of telling. You can clearly notice that in the way he handled character arcs and emotions, using sometimes symbolism, most of the time subtle and slow yet significant development, and lastly, his unique art style. You can see that with Gin being likened to a snake and the feeling of discomfort you get because of his facial expressions and the way he acts, which made it extremely difficult to see through his actions. But for the few scenes he was around Rangiko, judging from the way his personality shifted, you can easily read through him and infer that he loved her even if it was not explicitly stated. You can also see that in Orihime's growth, going from her whiny immature self that keeps screaming Ichigo's name whenever he is facing an enemy, to a grown version of herself that has a lot of control over her emotions, in a scene as subtle as the one where she is unbothered by Ibarn declaring war on Ichigo. However, the prime example in my opinion of Kubo showing instead of telling is Ichigo himself, especially in the first two arcs. Ichigo struggled internally with self-blame and the ability to accept himself because he caused his mother's death. His internal struggles were reflected on his personality, facial expressions, and more importantly, his actions, as Ichigo had the desire to protect his loved ones just like what his mother did with him and to fulfill his purpose. It was really easy to tell based on how Ichigo looked and acted that his gloomy and grumpy personality in the first arc was not his normal self, but rather a persona induced by his internal struggles. And in the Soul Society arc, when he gets to partially resolve one of these internal struggles by protecting Rukia, you can see the slow shift in his mental state and the way he acted and looked over the course of the arc, going from a grumpy dude to being a bit closer to his personality when his mom was around, which is something that he himself recognizes, hence thanks Rukia for stopping the rain, as in stopping his sadness. A powerful plot point that is addressed later in a similar manner in the Arrancar Saga, however this time by both Rangiko and Orihime. But first, I need to give some context. From the moment Orihime was born, she depended entirely on her brother, but after she lost him, Orihime suffered from loneliness and self-blame. Orihime believes she was the reason why her brother couldn't rest in peace because she begged him to stay around her. But after she let go of her brother and apologizes for being too dependent on him, she grew even more attached to Ichigo since she loves him. And guess what? She depended on him too all the time, as Ichigo always provided Orihime with protection since he cared for her, in which got him into situations where he is hurt. And because of that, she felt as if she causes the suffering to all the people close to her, especially Ichigo. Unlike Rukia, who lifted his spirit up when he was down and cured his sadness when he only knew her for a couple of months, which is something that Orihime couldn't do during their time in school. Rangiko then tells Orihime that Ichigo needs her as much as he needs Rukia, because without the bond he has with her, he wouldn't remain as he is, which is something crucial that Orihime didn't fully understand its value until she met with Olikyora, a guy that doesn't even understand human bonds or emotions, let alone value them. And here you can see Kubo's magnum opus in my opinion, where he can seamlessly connect different themes from different character arcs to form a plotline or general story theme, which is something that he has done all the time, but especially in the Arrancar Saga. Although the Arrancar Saga is usually regarded by some people as an all fights no story part of Bleach, which I don't fully disagree by the way, the plot didn't make much progression. However, this part is one of my all-time favorites in anime, as it has by far the most exposure to Bleach's core themes, as well as it heavily tying together what has already been established in the previous arcs to what is to come next. And one of the best examples I can give is the roller coaster of emotions we had with Orihime, Ichigo, and Olikyora. In this example, you can see how Kubo connected the journey of Orihime trying to be more useful by overcoming her mental weaknesses and past traumas, with Ichigo's journey trying to protect his loved ones, dealing with the internal conflict between the opposing sides of his soul while enduring a seemingly hopeless situation and refusing to give up, which is a theme that gets expanded upon later in Ichigo's battle against Yuha, but that is a discussion for another video. And lastly, Olikyora's pursuit to understand human emotions. From the beginning of the Arrancar Saga, when Ulquiorra tried to kidnap Orihime by threatening to hurt her friends if she didn't comply, knowing how strong their opponents are, Orihime complied, thinking she was doing the right thing by not being useless and that this is gonna be better for her friends' safety. But what she completely missed is how much her friends value the bond they shared with her over their safety. And no matter what danger they are going to face, they are gonna be there for her. Orihime couldn't understand the fact that she was not really useless after all. Her being there for her friends, sharing a strong bond with them, is something that gave their life a meaning. And losing such bond will result in something similar to what happened to Ichigo and his family when he lost his mother, the son they all revolved around, which on top of his desire to protect his loved ones, including Orihime, is another reason to why Ichigo is so persistent in not letting her go, as he doesn't want to go through the same agony again. Deep in his heart, these desires are what drove him to not give up and fight. On the other hand though, not understanding such bond or feelings will result in a scenario similar to that of Ulquiorra. Orihime, having realized all of that, changes her mind about staying in Wako Mundo for her friend's sake and decides to do whatever it takes. She endured physical abuse that exceeds the one she dealt with in her early days. She overcame the past traumas of seeing the one she cares for the most become a monster because of her, and decided to do her role so that Ichigo doesn't end up like her brother by being there for him and supporting him emotionally, so that she can return with him and all of her friends, as she too values the bond she shares with them. For her, it was inappropriate to be scared or anxious anymore, as she realized they had her heart, which is something that Ulquiorra didn't understand in the slightest, yet made him curious, hence why he repeatedly asks her in an attempt to understand human emotions, why isn't she scared of him, and what is the meaning of the word heart that she keeps tossing around. In his battle against Ichigo, Ulquiorra finally got to understand what a heart is, by seeing both Ichigo and Orihime grow stronger every time they persevere through their fears and refuse to abandon their willpower, because ultimately what they were protecting was their heart. Now this wouldn't be a proper video about the poetic storytelling without mentioning Kubo's excellent use of poetry to fulfill multiple purposes. The concept of life and death, for example, is one of Bleach's main themes, and it is what drives most characters to act. And you can see how Kubo simultaneously emphasized the thick concept all along the series using volume poems while developing or complementing a character by showing us their perspective on the thick concept. Rukia's volume 2 poem says, "People have hope because they don't see death standing behind them." This poem is linked to Aizen's final speech about the courage, where he tells Yuha that in a world without the fear of death, people will lose the hope they find when they persevere through that fear, hence why Aizen describes a world without death as unfavorable. White's volume 25 poem says, "We're all born dead. The end exists before anything begins. If living is a constant quest for awareness, the awareness we gain at the end is the real goal. In other words, death." And I believe this poem is showing us the concept of death from the Hollows' point of view. Since Hollows are essentially deceased humans that gain the awareness about the spiritual realm when they die. Kubo also dedicated a lot of poems solely for complementing and developing characters. The poems dedicated for multiple espadas that reflect on their nature and the aspect of death they represent. Ulquiorra and the lack of meaning, aka nihilism, Haribel and sacrifice, Grimjo and destruction, and so on and so forth. Yamamoto's poem in volume 45 that says, "Do not live bowing on your knees, die standing on your feet," which is an ideal that Yamamoto died upholding. Gin's poem in volume 20 about love, which actually acts as a foreshadowing to the revelation of his motives. Aizen's volume 12 poem says, "We think a flower on a cliff is beautiful because we stop our feet at the cliff's edge, unable to step out into the sky like the fearless flower," which emphasizes a core theme about Aizen's character, which is the courage, as he believes that courage is what gives people life a meaning, and also that overcoming one's fear is necessary for evolution. But volume poems were not the only place where Kubo used poetry, as he used it a couple of times in the manga itself. However, my favorite instance is in chapter 205.1, when Ichigo demands a blade that can cut fate, and by analyzing Bleach's narrative, I can see it happening in the final battle against Yuha, making Ichigo's throw Bankai a power that defies fate itself. And it can actually make sense for both Ichigo and Yuha's story arcs, but maybe that's a discussion for another video. If you reached this far, please consider subscribing.